After 3 months of rigorous physical and mental training, Seaman sat on the bench press, focusing intently on controlling his aura. The ultimate supreme training had proven incredibly challenging, but he reminded himself that if this method could finally free him from his limitations, he'd endure it 100 times over if needed. Leaning forward, he resumed focusing his aura, visualizing the precision of threading a needle, just as Doko Chinmei had taught him. He recalled Chinmei's words about aura. It flows like water and spreads like roots. Concentrating on the blocked points in his circulation, Seaman pushed forward, attempting to break through in a single powerful surge. Suddenly, he felt his aura flowing freely through his head and hands. With a shout of excitement, he realized he'd done it. Though he collapsed back onto the bench in exhaustion, he smiled, knowing he was getting stronger. Later, at Tyson Academy, a private raid training facility, the coach was watching students train when one of them informed him that someone was there to see him. Coach Chuang Jonghoon hurried to the entrance, where he was greeted by a familiar face. Overwhelmed, Jonghoon congratulated Seaman, expressing his pride and saying he'd always believed in him, regardless of whether he became a raider or not. Hugging him warmly, Jonghoon suggested they grab a drink to celebrate. Calling him brother, Seaman explained he was there for a different reason and demonstrated his newly flowing aura, leaving Jonghoon stunned. Impressed, Jonghoon quickly told the other students to continue self-training while he led Seaman to measure his aura. A short while later, Seaman was in the aura measuring machine, eyes closed as he waited for Jonghoon's reaction. Jonghoon urged him to look for himself, and when Seaman opened his eyes, he saw an aura level of 1034. Tears welled up as Jonghoon congratulated him, saying his curse was finally lifted. Stepping out of the machine, Seaman marveled at just a month of consistent aura circulation using the ultimate supreme technique had achieved what he'd struggled with for years. Jonghoon, equally astonished, asked how he'd managed to accomplish it. Seaman explained he'd simply followed advice from a chance encounter. Fascinated, Jonghoon suggested they test his abilities further by sparring with a particularly overconfident student who relied too heavily on his aura level. Confident that Seaman could humble the student, Jonghoon asked if he'd be up for the challenge, and Seaman agreed. Soon after, they were back in the academy training hall, with Seaman standing on the stage alongside Jonghoon and his opponent. The student, Yu Jin-se, skeptically questioned Jonghoon about sparring with Seaman and asked what Seaman's aura level was. Jonghoon replied it was around 1000, prompting Jin-se to glare, wondering if Jonghoon was seriously pairing him with someone who had just barely reached that level. Assuming Seaman was Jonghoon's prized disciple, Jin-se introduced himself, and Seaman returned the introduction. They took their positions for an unarmed fight, and at the referee's signal, the match began. Jin-se immediately lunged forward, aiming to crush Seaman with raw aura alone. Seaman easily dodged, ducked his head, and countered with a punch to Jin-se's face. However, the impact sent a painful tremor up his arm, as though he'd struck a wall. Jin-se, noticing, teasingly asked if he was all right. As Seaman pulled back, Jin-se complimented him on having basic skills, then dashed forward, kicking Seaman with increased force and warning him that things were only beginning. The kick threw Seaman across the ring, but instead of standing, he waited as Jin-se charged again, certain he'd finish the match. At the last second, Seaman grabbed Jin-se's foot, lifting and pulling him off balance. Surprised, Jin-se found himself thrown to the mat, wondering if Seaman was using grappling techniques. Seaman slammed Jin-se onto the stage, aware that most raiders didn't spend much time practicing martial arts. Raiders typically fought monstrous creatures that weren't humanoid, making hand-to-hand combat skills less relevant. But here, it was a different story. As Seaman held him down, Jin-se attempted to kick him with his free foot, but Seaman swiftly jumped back, dodging the move. The students laughed, teasing Jin-se for kicking the air. Embarrassed, Jin-se quickly stood to face him again, his expression furious. Charging forward, Jin-se threw a punch, but Seaman ducked in time and countered with a powerful uppercut, knocking Jin-se back to the stage floor. Before Jin-se could recover, Seaman wrapped his legs around him and grabbed his arm, putting Jin-se in an armbar. Furious, Jin-se wrapped a strong aura on his hands and launched a punch on Seaman. The other students and Jonghoon watched in panic, knowing the damage Jin-se's aura could cause. Remaining calm, Seaman, though frustrated, decisively snapped Jin-se's arm to prevent him from going berserk. Later, Seaman jogged through the streets, reminding himself not to get too excited. After all, Jinsei hadn't put in proper training or shown any real passion, and Seaman's win was simply the result of months of grueling practice finally paying off. Still, despite trying to stay humble, he couldn't hide the happiness on his face. The next day, Seaman was back at the gym, training his newly built muscles. He just finished a set with a heavy barbell and was catching his breath when he noticed two students at the entrance, staring at him in awe. They whispered to each other, wondering if they should approach him, and he noticed that one was holding a flyer featuring his own before and after transformation. Rising in silence, he flexed his muscles, pretending to comment on the heat. The students watched in amazement until one of them, wearing glasses, called him Uncle. Annoyed, Seaman asked what he meant by uncle, prompting the student to correct himself, calling him brother, and asking if it was true that his body had transformed in just 3 months. Seaman replied proudly that it was. The student, eyes full of hope, asked if he too could achieve the same results. Seaman replied that the order was wrong. They had to start with respect. Just then, Coach Deokbi appeared behind them, pointing out that the students should pay their boss. The students turned in horror as Deokbi greeted them, calling them new members and gripping their shoulders tightly. Leading them to his office, he introduced himself, and though nervous, the students followed him. Moments later, screams of terror echoed from the office. Deokbi emerged shortly after, with the students looking thoroughly drained, and explained to Seaman that they committed to following his same training course. Seaman laughed, asking if Deokbi thought they'd last. Deokbi replied that they'd even signed an agreement showing unexpected determination. Seaman gave them a thumbs up and wished them luck, which they acknowledged with awkward smiles. Remembering something, Seaman checked his phone, opening his Transcendent Network account to browse the tip board for new martial arts techniques. He noted with curiosity that the site was accessible on mobile now and found a technique titled The Beginning of Martial Arts Training, Jin Yi Quan. Soon after, the two students lay exhausted on the gym floor. The one with glasses admitted he felt like he was already dying, even on the first day. Both of them glanced over at Seaman, who's stretching his arm. They watched in amazement as a faint blue aura radiated from his body. Realizing he must be a raider, the student with curly hair remarked that Seaman was like a senior to them, and the other student nodded in agreement, awed by his dedication. Days later, Seaman was back at the gym, noticing strange gazes following him during his workouts. He soon realized it was the skinny, nerdy newbie from earlier, who had been staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Wondering why the kid was watching him so closely, Seaman assured himself that he wasn't interested in guys. Just then, the nerd approached him, catching him by surprise. The nerd confessed that he'd been observing Seaman for some time and had figured something out about him. Confused, Seaman asked what he meant. With a gleam of excitement, the nerd announced that he had discovered Seaman's identity. Stunned and a bit nervous, Seaman stammered, asking what the nerd meant by identity, only for the nerd to laugh and assure him he didn't need to hide it. Relieved, Seaman admitted that, yes, he was a raider. Relieved the nerd wasn't asking about anything involving the Transcendent Network. Seaman clarified that he wasn't a formal raider yet, but would be taking the qualification test soon. The nerd, who knew the test was a month away, confessed he was envious and wished he could take it too. Surprising Seaman, the nerd displayed his own aura, explaining that he was also an awakened one. Curious, Seaman asked why he wasn't attending a raider academy. The nerd explained that his parents thought being a raider was too dangerous and wanted him to focus on his studies until he was an adult. However, he still wanted to build up his strength. He added that many top raiders had been late bloomers and that becoming a true raider required not just aura but countless hours of training and effort. The nerd then confidently stated that he would definitely become a raider. Amused, Seaman asked why he was so certain. The nerd replied with a grin, saying it was obvious. Being a raider was the top-ranked career choice among middle and high school students in Korea because it was a cool job. Smiling, Seaman asked if he could control his aura, and when the nerd said yes, he encouraged him to give it a try. Hesitant but eager, the nerd sat down and focused, attempting to control his aura while Seaman watched. Impressed, Seaman praised the nerd's technique, asking where he'd learned it. The nerd explained that he'd followed a beginner's course by Raider on Sonjong. Seaman chuckled, advising him to keep practicing since aura control was vital. Then, with a hint of encouragement, he told the nerd that they were in this together and that they should aim to reach the top. The compliment boosted the nerd's confidence, and he eagerly agreed, walking away with a huge smile, chatting animatedly with his friends. Watching the kid's excitement, Seaman felt it was a promising start for him. With renewed resolve, he slapped his face lightly, reminding himself to keep doing his best too. Later, back in his room, Seaman opened the next tip on the Transcendent Network, titled The Fundamentals of Aura Manipulation. Covering his mouth in excitement, he thought how just hearing the title made him eager to dive in. He mentally told Chinmat to wait a bit longer, grateful for the tips board, which was proving invaluable for honing his basics. Curious, he checked the general board and saw a post from Person, who mentioned he'd been busy dating lately and teasingly asked if Seaman was jealous. Liana, never one to miss a beat, commented, poking fun at Person's appearance and asking what dating even meant for someone with a face like his. Smiling, Seaman noted how peaceful the dimension felt with their familiar banter. He then searched for information on the upcoming Raider qualification test and saw that the in-depth test, considered the pinnacle of the exam, was random again this year. The in-depth test, known for its unique and unpredictable challenges, often determined the final result, as even those who passed the written, aura measurement, and combat evaluation sections could still fail this final stage. Recalling last year's test, he remembered there had been a debate section and wondered aloud how debates helped raiders, given the job was about fighting and killing monsters. Just then, he noticed a flyer advertising exclusive prediction questions for the in-depth test. Initially, he thought only overly cautious people would waste money on something like that. But after staring at the screen for a moment, he found himself calling the number on the flyer, asking about the price, whether the information was reliable, and if they had a contact within the association. When they provided him with the details, he immediately transferred the money, admitting to himself that he'd become one of those overly cautious guys. Setting down his phone, he thought to himself that he was now fully prepared, confident that soon the world would know the name Lee Seaman. The next day, Seaman was at the park, working out on a pull-up bar. He paused, sensing a familiar presence approaching. He turned to see the woman he'd encountered before, also out for a run. She noticed him as well and, despite his attempt to hide, approached him, mentioning that she recognized him. He stayed silent, so she commented on how much weight he'd lost, saying she almost didn't recognize him. Touting, he replied dismissively, telling her not to bother him and to continue on her way. Sensing his annoyance, she apologized for her past comment and introduced herself as Kim Siana. Begrudgingly, he introduced himself in return. Siana asked if he was a raider, and he replied that he was taking the test soon. She cheered him on, mentioning that she would be rooting for her company's rookie as well. Seaman responded with a hint of arrogance, saying that it sounded exciting. Irritated, she warned him not to underestimate her rookie, whom she called her company's next ace. Smirking, Seaman suggested they place a bet. When she asked what kind, he proposed that they see who wins, her rookie or him. That's all for today, guys. See you on the next upload.